Welcome to the Radiant Mission podcast. My name is Rebecca Twomey, and I'm here with my amazing sister and co-host, Rachel Smith.
Hello.
We are on a mission to encourage and inspire others as they navigate through their life and through their relationship with Christ. And I just want to mention we are a faith-based podcast, so we're approaching issues from a biblical lens. We have recently transitioned into this mini series on health, and we have a very, very special guest with us today. Her name is Paula Carper, and she is an amazing woman of God and a registered dietitian and a hormone expert in women's and men's hormones. So Paula, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you guys.
We've been talking
hanging out
you
with
up a
sisters.
Yes. Yeah.
These last couple episodes.
I can't wait to share what I have to share.
I really appreciate, we talked about on the last episode, my health journey, but more than how much I've appreciated learning from you and your wisdom is your friendship, because you've been such an amazing friend to me. And I know without a shadow of a doubt that the Lord put you in my life at this time for a reason. And so we're very honored to have you on and have this conversation with us.
Thank you. It's been a blessing, really. Pleasure's mine.
We love it. So Paula, we would love for you to just start by sharing a little bit more about who you are and what led you to help other women with their hormone health.
So I have been a registered dietitian for like 26 years. So I've got a lot of experience. And I worked in healthcare for a really long time. My background is that I started out in the fitness industry, and I come from a long line of dancers. So took dance for a really long time as a child. And I parlayed that into a fitness aerobic instruction, kind of aerobic classes kind of phase back in the late 80s, early 90s, and then worked in a wellness center in college, in a hospital setting. And it was really a great merging of the things that I loved, which was nutrition and health and fitness. And so, so through a long journey of working in healthcare and seeing that what healthcare has to offer, the healthcare system has to offer, is not exactly what I had in mind when I wanted to become a dietitian, because I felt like nutrition was a way to build health and restore health. And I just didn't see nutrition being an important piece of the healthcare system. So that was one thing that kind of brought me to where I am. And then the other piece was that I had my own health crisis, and my hormones were completely out of whack. And I had lots of extreme issues going on, including extreme fatigue. And I basically was having burnout and hormone imbalance, and my own battle with endometriosis and uterine fibroids, some things that come along later in most women's lives. And so that was really a turning point for me, because I started looking for solutions, and the healthcare system just didn't have the solutions that I was really hoping for. Surgery was the number one solution that was recommended to me at 38. The doctor wanted me to have hysterectomy, and it was a gynecologist. It was a female gynecologist. And I thought that was absurd. I had not been married and had children at that point, and I do not have children of my own, but I think ultimately that was still, there was a window in my mind, and I was like, that's a really drastic thing to do. So that was a really motivating factor in this journey for me. And so I started digging deeper into my background in biochemistry, physiology, all that kind of stuff, and ended up in the functional medicine space, and discovered that functional medicine was a really root cause kind of approach that I really resonated with. And that's really what led me to that. And then, of course, being a woman who was in the later stages of life of my cycle, that was really kind of where I started getting passionate about like helping other women who are experiencing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating. And particularly what you mentioned about being recommended to have a hysterectomy at 38.
Yeah.
I personally know a number of women in my life that have had the exact same recommendation. at the same age or around the same age to potentially solve, right? The potential root cause of what a woman is experiencing. This wasn't even a question that was on my list, but now I'm curious because I'm sure there are other women listening in that either are having problems themselves and maybe had this recommendation or know someone. So what is your advice in this area? Because you know more than anyone that all of our hormones are connected. And when we remove something like our uterus, what happens?
Yeah. So I think the key factor here is that we're removing something that will remove some of the symptoms in this case. And in my case, that's what it was. And in many cases, women who have uterine fibroids, the recommendation will be to have a hysterectomy, depending on the size and the severity. Endometriosis, there's some different things that go along with that, but ultimately the problem in both of those cases is that there is a high level of estrogen that's involved. There are a variety of reasons that might be the case. And so you have to start thinking about digging deeper into what the real underlying problem is. And just like, with gallbladders, it's kind of the same thing with a uterus. It's like you take it out and you might be able to live without it, but there are consequences to that. And for women, the consequences of having their uterus removed, it doesn't necessarily if they just have the uterus removed. So that's just a hysterectomy with the ovaries staying intact. You will have still continue to have hormone production. So that's one way. But if you have everything removed, the ovaries and the uterus, you lose that hormone production. So there's that piece, and every situation is going to be a little bit different about what's recommended. Most doctors seem to want to allow you to keep your ovaries if at all possible, if there's not some kind of disease process going on there. So, I think that's a factor, but I think ultimately we have to dig deeper and say what's causing the hormone imbalance that's causing this condition or causing these symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we want to dig deeper. And for personally, I kind of want to die with all my body parts, even my teeth. Like I'm like that's kind of a thing with me. I can't stand the idea of losing any parts of myself. It's weird. There's just something about it. But so I was like, even if I wasn't going to have children, I wanted to keep my parts if I could. And because I do believe that we can restore some function and that those parts really have some purpose in our lives, even when they're not useful anymore. So I think that's really something to consider, is that if you are somebody who's been diagnosed with uterine fibroids or endometriosis, that you really want to start digging into what the underlying cause is. And oftentimes it's dysfunction in systems of the body that are causing these hormone imbalances. In the case of endometriosis, there is an immune dysfunction going on.
Okay.
And so you really have to understand that that's a big piece of the puzzle. And it's much more of an immune disorder that also has a hormonal component.
Oh, that's very interesting.
So that's very different. Yeah. And a lot of women don't understand that or don't know that. And it can be a really painful condition. A lot of your audience might even be experiencing that kind of thing. It's a debilitating thing for many women.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah.
I have kind of a dumb question real quick though, because it came to my mind as you were explaining that. If the uterus was taken out and the ovaries are left, what are they, like, they're not attached to anything, so they just float around in there?
No, they are. I mean, that's another aspect of what happens after you have a hysterectomy, is that, they go in and they're pulling a lot of stuff apart. And you have fascia, you have a peritoneal cavity that all this stuff is kind of in and surrounded by, and then you've got fascia, the connective tissue that surrounds all this stuff and kind of holds everything in place. And you've probably learned a little bit about connective tissue through my sister, who talks about MELT method all the time, which is a connective tissue self-care system. And so that's kind of how a lot of this stuff is not just like floating around and flopping around, in our
that's what I'm picturing.
In our abdomens. It's really kind of held by this collagen containing structures of this connective tissue. And that stuff has to, when they go in and they cut on you, they're cutting all that around the uterus off. And it loses a lot of its ability to function. And then there's scar tissue created and a lot of different things that happen. So once they cut stuff out of you in that area of the body, particularly, that stuff it kind of gets all shoved back in there.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen any surgeries on YouTube, but it can be kind of scary to want to go into surgery, but the healing process, I don't think we have a lot of modalities that support those kind of healing processes to avoid scar tissues and the things that might come up with that, come up after that. So that's another piece that I think a lot of women experience difficulties with some of the complications that come after abdominal surgeries like that, especially.
Okay.
Now, you obviously found healing without having the hysterectomy, correct?
Yeah, I did.
And
I did.
so there is hope out there for women that do have issues of these sorts. And that's a lot of what you're going to talk about or share with us today is some little tidbits. But please, if you are interested in chatting with Paula, I know she would be happy to chat with you. So before we go any further, where can anybody who hears something in this episode, where can they find you if they need to find you after this?
Okay, yeah. So I am on social media. I'm not super active right now because I've been in the middle of lots of things. But my Instagram account is at Paula Carper RD, and my last name is Carper CARPER. And then the website is paulacarper.com. And you can find me there. I do write some blog posts. I am going to be starting a podcast real soon. So hopefully you'll be able to find me on all kinds of places where podcasts are hosted.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Awesome. I know people are going to want to be reaching out to you after this. And Paula, you specifically focus quite a bit on women that are approaching menopause. You obviously helped my sister who was going through fertility type of stuff. So you kind of have that pathway for women pre-menopause and women that are going into menopause and beyond. So no one is left out. Yes, we're all here. But I would love for you to share kind of a 101 for us on hormones. What should every woman know about their hormones and how they function?
Yeah. So I think that if you've even had any health classes in your education background from, whether it's junior high, high school, you probably have forgotten it. And you might not have been listening that day, right?
Yeah. Nobody knows any of that stuff.
So what I always want people to know, I want to tie it back to like the things that are very fundamental that they understand. And so I come back to design and women's hormone cycles and their hormones revolve around their reproductive capabilities. So the fact that we were designed to create and nurture and carry and deliver babies and birth babies into the world is why we have the hormones that we have. That's one big piece of the puzzle. Obviously there's, chromosomes, that make us who we are, male, female, but then there's the hormones and the balance of hormones that we have that also gives us our secondary sex characteristics, our breasts and, other parts of our bodies that develop when we hit puberty. And so that's a really important piece because we have to come back to that and say, okay, well, if our hormones are revolved around our reproductive cycles and capabilities, then that's something we need to understand. So then understanding your menstrual cycle is a really important piece of this. We have two phases of the menstrual cycle, and that's the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So if there's the first half and the second half, I'm sure you can do some more research on that if you want, but it's also punctuated by the day that the period starts. We all know that day. And that's considered day 1 of the cycle. And then there's day 14 of the cycle on average, of course, that you might ovulate. And that's where the punctuations in the cycle are. And of course, when you ovulate, that's preparation for becoming pregnant. That's the release of that egg. So that's one of the things you need to understand. And the hormones fluctuate. We have estrogen, progesterone, and we have testosterone, just like men do. We just have it in a different balance. And then it changes and ebbs and flows throughout the cycle. Estrogen is dominant in the first half of the cycle, and progesterone is dominant in the second half of the cycle. And so those are just things you want to know. And the egg that's released, and that what's called a corpus luteum that's left behind that releases the egg, that's what produces that progesterone. So
interesting.
so having that healthy egg production, having that healthy corpus luteum, all those things are going to really help with your progesterone production in that second half, which is where, like I said, it's highest. And that's what helps prepare the uterus more for that implantation and kind of get things going when you do get pregnant. So there's a lot going on there. And if you don't get pregnant, of course, then, the lining of your uterus sheds, and there we go again. So there's just this cycle, and understanding why we even have a period. That's a really important thing. I do want to mention real quick, because I'm thinking about that, because I ask people about their periods a lot, and women will tell me about their periods, but they're on birth control. And sometimes I'll ask them that before I know that they're on birth control. A bleed when you're on birth control is not a period. And a lot of people, I find, do not understand that. So that's a really important factor to understand. It is a withdrawal bleed. It is withdrawing from the hormones that actually causes you to bleed.
That's very interesting. So I was going to ask you, do you actually then shed the lining of your uterus when you're on birth control?
So you
happens?
you are shedding some of that, because there is some buildup, but you're not actually ovulating, because that's what birth control suppresses, is the ovulation. So
wow. And so that
yeah,
makes
definitely.
sense to why we're hearing so much, obviously, about women on birth control having cancers and having other health problems or other issues. I know I myself had a ton of health issues as a result of birth control.
Yeah.
And what I hear you saying makes so much sense as to why. If you're going to suppress your female body, which was intended to ovulate once a month, or, once a month when you go through your cycle, and now you suppress it for potentially years, for potentially a decade or
Yep.
decade and a half or two, that's definitely going to mess up the natural flow of your hormones and what they're supposed to do.
Absolutely. And yeah, we see there's such a thing called, post birth control syndrome now that people are talking about, because there are a lot of vitamins and minerals that you actually kind of utilize a lot of, and then some that you just don't get enough of. And you need more of when you are on birth control. So that's another thing. And that's a very personal choice. Obviously, I understand, I know we're talking about things also from our perspective of being Christ followers. And I think there's still a lot of different opinions about birth control, but I do think when we talk about hormonal birth control, we really have to understand that we are doing something to suppress that natural process, and that we can't expect great outcomes when we have an intervention that's so fundamental.
I've heard doctors say before that hormonal birth control is like tricking your body into thinking that you're pregnant. But then I recently heard someone say, no, it's actually more related to tricking your body thinking you're in menopause or postmenopause. Would you
Your
say
har-
either of those statements are accurate?
your hormones actually, your hormones are actually, the profile of your hormones is actually more like you're in menopause.
Okay. That makes more sense.
Yeah.
So Paula, what you mentioned about, people's choices with birth control and biblical perspective, after falling into the trap of birth control, which I went on birth control when I was a teenager because I had heavy periods, and that is how OBGYNs solve problems. Here's a magic pill for you. It will fix everything.
Absolutely.
I fell into that trap that we all fall into. After years of experiencing the after effects of all of what these drugs do to you, I actually am of the belief that birth control is from the enemy. But that's a hot opinion. A lot of people aren't going to like that, or will be very against that. But I have nothing good to say about it.
Yeah.
It has done nothing good or positive for my life except for making me sick and cause problems. So
yeah. Well, in the case of hormonal birth control, for sure, I
Even the
would have a
non-hormonal,
similar.
Paula, I had a copper
I had a
IUD.
feeling about that. Well, a copper IUD affects your hormones, though.
And
Yeah.
It's not considered a hormonal birth control form of birth control, but it does disrupt your hormones. So I think when we can talk about other kinds of birth control, we can talk about, the natural family planning. That's what's now considered fertility awareness method.
Yeah.
We can talk about, of course, condoms, barrier protection.
Mhm.
Those don't have as much of an impact on your physiology. And I think that's really like, again, then we have another set of questions that we have to decide theologically, right? What we believe about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think there's a whole spectrum, a whole range of perspectives about that. But yeah, I would definitely agree that that it is definitely been used as a tool of the enemy, to let us think that we can divorce the natural effects of what sexual relationships were meant to create.
Yes.
And it actually takes away, it's blocking our power to actually create. So there's some fundamental spiritual things, I'm sure, around that are also implicated,
And even attraction. They say that being on hormonal birth control can change your attraction to your partner.
Yep. Absolutely. Again,
there's a lot of I don't know what the word is, a lot of deception that goes on with this, but I guess we could have a whole episode on that.
Oh, we could. Right. We could. I know we could.
Hot take on birth control.
Yeah.
Well, what are some actually, Paula, common myths about hormones that exist that you hear from people all the time that they say about hormones?
So probably what I hear, like in the conventional model, because I hear this a lot from like my clients coming from me. My doctor said my hormones are fine. And that usually involves doctors, excuse me. That usually involves doctors doing some serum or blood labs on their patient, and testing maybe estradiol, testosterone, and progesterone. And they will often test it whenever you go to the lab. And remember, I said earlier, we have cycles of hormones. So if you go to the lab on any day of your cycle and you test your hormones, it's going to be different on any day of your cycle.
True.
So that's one thing, is that serum labs or blood labs are not telling the whole story, outside of the fact that you might be taking them on any given day, and your doctor may not give you direction on what day of the month you should actually do those. You also have the fact that your hormones in your blood, in the serum, are bound. They are the storage form of your hormones. So they are not the active hormones that are acting on the tissues in your body. And so that's another piece of the puzzle. So a big myth, I think, is that your blood hormones tell the whole story. They do not. And most women don't really understand that at all. They go to the doctor, they have the serum labs drawn, maybe it's at their annual gynecological visit, and then they have their lab work and they say, oh, it's fine, everything's normal. But a lot of times your symptoms will be telling you something different. And women should know to really listen to that. Their intuition is important.
That's what I felt really empowered by you when we were having these conversations about my, cycle and my hormones, even before we did testing, is you like really, brought that point home of trusting what I was feeling.
Yeah.
Like I felt a certain way right before my period would start, like a psychopath. That's what I felt like. And no doctor ever cared about this. I would mention it like, it really doesn't seem good the way that I feel before my cycle starts, but you really take that seriously, that no, it does matter. Like this is indicating something, and Absolutely. It did. So, and then like I learned firsthand from you of like, and we talked about this, on our episode about my health journey, is doing the Dutch hormone panel, which is really intensive. And also it's through the urine. And also you were very adamant that it has to be this specific day or two in your cycle, because that's when certain hormones should be peaking, like progesterone. And then you can really get a clear picture. So
Yeah.
I feel like that's really practical advice for women.
Yeah. Yeah. And that the dried urine hormone tests or 24-hour hormone tests that used to be kind of a more where you carried a jug of urine around with you all day and collected it. It's definitely the Dutch test has really like come a long way in terms of dried urine testing, to be able to just like, pee on a piece of paper and at some different intervals and stuff like that. And even the Dutch panel gives us a lot of information because of the way we do decide to time the collection. And there are Dutch hormone tests that we can actually collect throughout the cycle. We have what's called cycle mapping that we do with the Dutch hormone testing as well for people who really need a lot more information. And so sometimes we have to use that kind of testing as well. But this kind of information, still, we have to remember that lab data, any lab data we get, are snapshots of things for us. They're moments in time. But if we understand physiology, we can leverage that. We can figure out like, what's the best timing for this? What do we know about the timing of this progesterone level? When is it highest? Oh, we know that it's generally around day 19 to day 22. Okay, we can time it for that. So that's some things that I think, even when we look at like serum labs, you could still get some information from serum labs. It's just that it's not the whole picture. And so we really have to look at like, what clues does this information give us? And then how do we use that information to inform what we're doing, what we understand now about your hormones, and then what we're going to actually do to intervene.
Yes, which is going to be what you're eating, what you're not eating, what
Yeah.
supplements you're taking, what kind of supplements you can take. I know for Rachel, we talked about on her episode about methylated supplements
Yeah.
instead
Yeah.
of just traditional. Which actually, again, this is not a question that I had planned to ask you, but now I want to know. A lot of people, I think if I'm going to take a supplement, I'll just go to this grocery store and just buy
Yeah.
something. What is the difference between someone just buying something
Yeah.
and using a supplement that is not sold at the grocery store? Or are there good is there good supplements at the grocery store?
There are a couple ways to answer that question. One is that most retail supplements can tend to have a lot of fillers, because they're just not as regulated in terms of the kinds of things that are being added to them.
And what is a filler?
So it might be fillers. It might be, silicone dioxide is like one of the things that you might see a lot of in over-the-counter supplements, and you might see them in some of the professional grade supplements. But it's just that you'll tend to have a little less better quality and then less stringent manufacturing standards in a lot of retail products. Now, I say that, and there are some products that are available retail that are also available in my professional grade online dispensary that I will sometimes recommend because they do have some pretty good standards around their manufacturing. But I think the other side of that answer, or the other way to answer that question, is also in respect to how people generally tend to approach supplements as consumers. And as consumers, they tend to just either see something or hear something in the media, or hear something from a friend that something worked for them or whatever. And they just go out and they say, this was good for such and such for this particular ailment. I'm going to take this. And the problem that I have with that, and people don't realize, is that many nutrients you don't need in the quantities that maybe you're taking them in. You don't know what quantities you need. You don't even know if you actually need them. So you could be paying for expensive urine in many cases. So there's that piece, but there's also the idea that, like with minerals, especially, minerals have to be in balance. There are complementary minerals that need to be in balance. And so if you take one mineral and you're not in balance with other minerals, you can create imbalances in your mineral status. So these are things that the lay people and the public population just don't know. And the other side of that is that we tend to think of, when we hear in the media about some research, a lot of times this research is done on populations, and it's based on populations and not on individuals. And that's kind of where the methylation piece comes in, like with Rachel's health, is that one of the things that I do is I do genetic testing, and it's called nutrigenomic testing. And we test to see what genes you have, and what variations of those genes might cause you to have different function in the way that your body interacts with certain nutrients. And that's where we discovered, like in Rachel's case, that she doesn't actually have the ability to convert very well the food form of folate or folic acid that you might take in a supplement form or in fortified foods into the active form that the body actually can use. And so that's what the methylated B vitamin supplement is about, is methylating those forms that she can't actually create in her own body, from those natural food sources or from those folic acid sources. And so so there's that piece too, where sometimes people don't know that they're not taking something that they're taking something that their body might not even be able to use. So there are those pieces. And the population studies are nice because they kind of tell us in general what might be the case for most people. But when we get into personalized medicine, which nutrigenomics helps us with that, we can actually get into much more personalized medicine, personalized protocols, individual variations that you have can be addressed for what's going on with you. And that's something that I love, because I believe that we have some general broad things. We talk about the menstrual cycle. These are things that are pretty much the same for everybody, but there's variations in that for women, even in terms of length of cycles, in terms of general trends and tendencies. And some of that depends on their genetics. And we can even look at women's hormone health genetics to really find out more about why their hormones might be out of balance in many cases too. So there's that piece as well.
Since you brought the genetic thing up, I mentioned that in my testimony and how we did the genetic testing and what we found, and there was a lot of intensive information there. But one thing I kind of took away from it, because we kind of started with some things with me first, and then you're like, I really think we should do genetic testing because of the way I was reacting to supplements, actually, which now everything you're saying makes so much more sense. But it kind of made me realize, and so what I want to ask you is, do you typically, in a perfect world with a client, would you recommend doing genetic testing like first before everything? Or I mean, I know you kind of navigated around things with me, but how does genetic testing normally like play a role for you?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I've actually kind of gone back and forth with this over time, because I try to make everybody's journey with this, when I'm working with people individually and not in like group settings, I try to make it very customized, right? And so I've played around with it and kind of done a lot of different things. Like sometimes I do hormone testing first. Sometimes I'm, based on what the history and the symptoms are, I might do gut testing first. But recently I've kind of come back around to really deciding that the hormone panels probably should come first. And for the biggest reason is that there's so many upstream functions that we can address when we look at the genetics, because these are a lot of times cellular functions around hormones, functions around methylation pathways, functions around that it really affects hormones, and it also affects detoxification, B12, all the different things. And it also affects things like autophagy and immune function. So we can look at all those things. And I have my own hormone panel that I actually use that allows me to look at the women's health genetics, but also allows me to look at some of these other areas of health that I think have a huge impact on hormones. So I've really kind of come back around to prioritizing that first, because I think we can do some real broad interventions first. And I'm a firm believer that many of the interventions that women need when they're coming in with hormone imbalance or infertility or anything like that are really foundational and can cover a broad range of symptoms and help with a broad range of symptoms when we start at the top. Like we start at the things that are most fundamental that can trickle down into a million different symptoms, and when we start to address those things at the top, that's when, you'll have 10 symptoms go away because you're addressing something that's so fundamental,
Yeah. Now, Rachel having a specific genetic marker, does that mean that I have the same marker as her sibling?
That's a good question. So identical twins will have the same, and I know that because I have an identical twin, and we did her testing on some of this because
And
we
it
were
was
curious,
identical?
like to make sure it was identical, because like some people say that you can look identical and not be identical, and I was like, yeah, I could see how that you could be really close, but we did that and that was fun and it was identical. But with siblings, there could be a broad variety of mixtures. You only have two parents, right? So you're getting a set of genes from each of your parents. But the number of combinations, because of the number of combinations of the number of genes that you have, that you're given by your parents, it's like the roulette wheel of what kinds of combinations you can have is just very high. Now, what I mean by that is that that's when we're looking at all the genes. When we're looking at one individual gene, there's only so many combinations you're going to potentially have from those two parents.
Okay.
And but the likelihood of you having, let's say she has what we call heterozygous variant, which means that she has one normal copy, one variation copy, then you might have the same, you might have normal. And if both your parents had a variant copy or not a normal copy, then you could potentially have, those both those copies of the variant.
Okay.
So that's something that when I look at siblings, I'm like, yeah, we'd probably need to check with the parents first if we were going to try to guess. But obviously, if we're going to try to do that, we're just say you need to test, right?
I think what I'm really trying to figure out here, Paula, is if I have to give up Chick-fil-A or not, if I have an MSG intolerance like Rachel. That's really at the heart of all of this.
Well, I could see how that would be a high priority.
Well,
high priority.
I forgot to mention this when we did talk about my GAD1 mutation. So it's best for me to avoid glutamine or glutamate.
Yeah.
And one thing that I did take away from when you explained it to me is for my body to function at its optimal health, I should avoid this for the most part.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean like I'm gonna die if I have it.
Sure.
Right.
What it did, I felt empowered knowing that is that I then am aware if I eat something and it has MSG in it and it makes me feel a certain way, like I feel more anxious or have headaches or, a little depressed the days following it, instead of feeling like a crazy person, I can be like, oh, I ate that MSG the other day. And I have avoided it for over 6 months. I have not consumed it whatsoever. We talked about in the last episode that I am now finally expecting. Ironically, the first and only craving I've been so sick, as both of you know, but I was sitting across from a woman at the airport and she opened a bag of Cool Ranch Doritos and it was the first thing that smelled good to me in months. And I know that Doritos have MSG in them. And I'm like, dang, I just really want some Cool Ranch Doritos. And I restrained myself for a few weeks. And then finally, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to eat them once to enjoy this craving because I'm so miserable because nothing tastes good and I'm so sick. And I will expect that I might not feel great. I did this like last week and I had a headache for 2 days.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, it was not worth it. They didn't even taste that great. So the point is, and I have had Chick-fil-A once or twice too. And I actually didn't get a headache the time I had that. But the point is of all this stuff in our genes is that we can be empowered to live in such a way that supports our body, but we
Mhm.
also don't have to like close ourselves off in a cave.
Yeah.
We just know when something is going to affect us negatively and, choose how we want to feel.
Absolutely.
I think too, what you said to me, Rachel, was even if somebody doesn't have a genetic marker that they should avoid monosodium glutamate, that they should probably avoid it anyway.
Right. Yeah.
It's generally a good idea.
Yeah, is that good health advice?
Yeah, it's definitely a neurostimulant, neurotoxin kind of effect on the brain, and it's definitely not something that I believe we were really designed to have a large exposure to.
What is it made out of anyway?
So that's a good question, but I don't think, I mean, it's got sodium, obviously.
Yeah.
So it's sodium and glutamate in terms of chemistry. How is it made? I don't know if that's the question you're asking. But it's sodium. It's a combination of sodium and glutamate, and that can have a huge impact on glutamine production. And that's why it can be a problem.
I
Because
Googled it.
glutamate production is glutamate is a neurochemical that definitely will stimulate your brain.
I Googled it while we were talking because I was really curious, and it's a fermentation process.
Oh.
I never knew that. Instead of extracting and crystallizing MSG from seaweed broth, MSG is produced by the fermentation of starch, sugar beets, sugarcane, or molasses, similar to how they make yogurt, vinegar, and wine. And they add all this stuff together. So I never thought about it as being fermented, which is interesting.
Well, for mass production instead of like a natural source, that makes a lot of sense. Like we're producing lots of MSG for lots of food products on the market, right?
Oh yeah.
Got to figure that, right?
And it's not even necessary, right? It's literally just to get people addicted to these foods.
It's
so
necessary,
it is necessary.
If you want, it's necessary if you want people to gorge themselves and keep buying your foods.
That's what I was smelling?
Exactly right.
When I smelled those Cool Ranch Doritos, it was the MSG. Like, oh, you gotta have some.
Yeah.
It's like somebody has a container of strawberries and they open it. Oh, those strawberries smell so good. No. Oh, do you smell those fries from all the way across the room? I mean, even the smell that is attached to these foods just sucks you in.
We're addicted.
Absolutely.
But until you know better, and then you know better, right?
Yeah.
Right, Paula?
Yeah. And I did want to address, like, one of the things that you were talking about, Rachel, as you were talking about that, it really brings me back to the thing that I will be talking about probably on my first podcast episode, because it's just something that I think a lot of people need to get a hold of in terms of the concept. But that is that we have the opportunity to create the environment that our bodies thrive in. And when we understand our genetics, we can really do that in much more finer points. Like we can really fine tune that environment that we create, because we can understand the differences that we have as, one sister to another versus, just the general population. And so I feel like that's a really great piece of why nutrigenomic testing can be so important for just anybody.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of our conversation with Paula Carper. We hope you enjoyed the information shared so far and invite you to join us next week for part 2 as we continue the conversation. Today, I'd like to close us with Proverbs 3, verses 7 through 8. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. Wishing you a radiant week, and we'll see you on the next one.